what they're doing now is saying, okay, we're going to do all this stuff by force. But it only really works if you get regime change. And that is really the lesson of what has happened before. We had a very successful set of, in military terms, attacks last summer when the Israeli and the U.S. Air Forces attacked the nuclear sites and other missile launchers, etc. They took out a lot of the air defenses, which has made this attack much easier. The lesson of that is that we're back. We're back here doing it again. And why? That's because there was no regime change. It is the same regime. They have the same goals. They have the means in order to rebuild their programs. They rebuilt the ballistic missile stuff that was destroyed fairly quickly. That's really the key here. Either it works, in which case you get regime change, or not.
Mona, what's your assessment of how other regional allies feel about this idea of regime change? Because if there is a power vacuum, if there is a civil war, they're the ones who are going to feel the consequences of that first. I'm thinking Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, Oman, the Omanis who were facilitating these negotiations that apparently were for naught. Are you hearing from these nations, do you have any kind of read about, even though they may not be fans of the Iranian regime, fears they might have around it imploding?
Well, they are absolutely not fans of the Iranian regime, and you're seeing some fairly sharp statements come out of both Saudi Arabia, the UAE, with respect to strikes that Iran has already taken, retaliatory strikes on U.S. targets in their countries. But that said, I think there's no doubt that this is a nightmare scenario for the neighboring Gulf countries. This is precisely what they had been hoping against and had been working diligently behind the scenes in order for negotiations and diplomacy to be successful. I heard early this morning from an Omani contact who said this is the worst scenario that we had feared playing out. And look, it's still early days. It's really hard to say exactly how the various repercussions are going to unfold. But I think this is going to get a lot more complicated in the coming days and perhaps even weeks.
Marc Champion, let me ask you about the politics of impatience, presidential impatience. It's become kind of a joke as we try to keep track of or count how many wars the president says he's solved. But what draws all of those together is the speed with which he says he's done it. And I look at Venezuela. Christina brought that up just a moment ago. That was a major event that happened over the course of not even 24 hours, but 12 hours. And I guess we see in the aftermath of that the difficulty on the ground in Venezuela of plotting a path forward. You have an interim president trying to negotiate who she's responsible to, her party, the people in Venezuela, or the Trump administration. To what Ambassador Bolton said just a few minutes ago, that this is a president who's going to have some stick-with-itedness here in Iran going forward, do you have any optimism that he's going to have that in light of what we've seen in these other adventures he's had around the world?
Well, no, but on the other hand, he may not have a lot of choice. That's the thing about starting a major war. This is not a special operation. What you had in Venezuela was a commando operation. It could have gone very badly wrong in the way that the operation, ordered by President Carter went wrong in 1979 in Iran. That could have gone wrong. It didn't. It went very well. And I think that's part of the reason why this is happening now, that basically the president has had two, very successful military operations. The first in Venezuela, the second was last summer when they bombed the nuclear sites in Iran and did that. Successfully. We don't know exactly, that they destroyed everything, but, the planes went home. There was a lot of damage done. And I think that encouraged him to go ahead and have a go now. It's just that I am very dubious that he has a full understanding of where, how difficult it is to control events once you begin a large-scale conflict, and also how difficult it can be to end them on your terms.
Mona, I'm wondering what your assessment was of the impact on Iran's nuclear program after that first round of strikes, because the president came out and said, we destroyed those facilities, we obliterated them. Nuclear experts I talked to were less sure. We're now talking about Iran having been able to build those back very quickly. Is that assessment accurate? And we also heard the president say there was an imminent threat. Was that breakout time that much different than it was 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks ago?
I don't think so. I mean, I think surely the president said obliterated for his own political reasons last June. But by all accounts, the nuclear facilities did sustain some amount, if not significant damage. And more importantly, there were no intelligence reports suggesting that Iran was imminently going to have a nuclear weapons capability. On the contrary, the negotiations that were ongoing were in fact focused on whether and how Iran might be willing to compromise its ambitions, potentially even down to zero enrichment. Now, it's not at all clear that we were there, and indeed, by many accounts, we were far apart. But I do think it's very hard to make the case that there was an imminent threat of Iranian nuclear capabilities.
We have some lines coming in from the State Department. This is from a U.S. official. Secretary of State Rubio laid out the situation and consulted the G8 on, that's that gang of 8 that we were talking about earlier, those top congressional leaders, in Tuesday in an hour-long briefing. And Secretary Rubio then made calls to all the members to give them a heads up ahead of time. They said he successfully connected with 7 of 8. One was unreachable.
We know John Thune, the leader in the Senate, was one of them, and he praised Secretary Rubio for the information that he got in advance of this. Marc, let me close by asking you about the gravity of what's happened here. So we've seen the president go to a podium at Mar-a-Lago, wearing no necktie, wearing a white baseball cap with USA emblazoned on it, release a statement not to any press, nobody was in the audience, posted on social media, and here we are. He's not scheduled to speak today as well. During those remarks, he did talk about the potential gravity here for U.S. troops overseas. There could be casualties. How do you think about him in this moment? He is a president at war now. He used the term. He didn't call this a special operation, as you pointed out a few moments ago. He has characterized this as a war. How do you contrast that, again, the gravity of the moment with the way that he, yes, at a face level, is approaching this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it was a surprise. I mean, this is the way that, President Trump has approached these things. It is extraordinarily different from previous United States presidents. It's not my taste that's how I would like to have, my leader announced that he's taking the country to war. But my preference would be also that he would go first to Congress and get permission for agreement for a war of choice, because, as was said before, there was no imminent threat here, even if the Iranians had been able to reconstitute their nuclear program. The program we're talking about, it's a uranium enrichment program. Mm-hmm. That's the first step towards building a warhead and putting it on a missile. It's not. There's a distance between those things. It's important. The breakout thing is an important issue, but it's not an imminent threat. It's Trump. It's entirely Trump. And I imagine that his base, likes that he thinks that image will work for him. Not to my taste, but that's who he is.